Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And Talli, this is episode number 10, so we're very excited that they have been so well received and that this podcast is growing. So we ask our listeners, please help us continue. Make sure to subscribe to Intimate Judaism on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please share this and other episodes. And of course, please go to intimatejudaism.com for additional content and to sign up for our email list. Something taught by many rabbis and other authorities is that the laws of family purity, Taharat HaMishpacha, Hilchot Nida, contribute to marital intimacy in a very direct way. By separating for approximately 12 days each month when a husband's wife gets her period, the sexual passion is reignited and the couple are able to experience a type of monthly honeymoon when they reunite. And this isn't just a modern idea that Kiruv Rabbi said, it's actually said in different terms in the Gemara, Masechet Nida, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, in the name of Rabbi Meir. And while this is certainly true for some couples, it decidedly is not true for all couples. The laws of Nida can be very difficult for some and can even impair intimacy in some situations. So today, Talli, let's discuss what a couple does when they find that the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha are damaging instead of enriching. And that's the subject of today's Intimate Judaism.
That's great, Scott. I'm glad that you are raising the topic of Taharat HaMishpacha and how it may enhance or not a couple's marriage, a couple's passion in their marriage, their sexual and their marital satisfaction. I'm really excited that later in the show, we're going to have two guests, two Yoatzot Halacha. I think we have a lot to say. I also want to thank our listeners who, at our request via Facebook and mailing, have sent us their personal but anonymous experiences, and that will add greatly to today's broadcast. I think the best thing to do would be for you to give an overview of the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha, of family purity, for listeners who are less familiar, and then we can go ahead and talk about the questions that you raised.
Okay, Talli. Well, of course, I'm going to be dealing with Taharat HaMishpacha as it's practiced, as opposed to the rabbinic and Torah laws of them. In practice, there is so much of a difference between what the Torah says about Taharat HaMishpacha and what we do nowadays. I'm not even going to get into that because that has no bearing, in all likelihood, on the vast majority of halachic situations. So essentially, once again, with the caveat, this is not a halachic program. I'm just giving an overview of the halachot. In general, a woman becomes a nida when she experiences uterine bleeding or has a stain of a certain color or feels a type of sensation, which is called a hargasha. Once again, that's a difficult topic, what exactly a hargasha is. Essentially, when she gets her period, she becomes a nida, for all intents and purposes. Once she is a nida, she must wait for her bleeding to stop or the 5th day from the beginning, whichever comes later. At that point, she counts 7 clean days, ensures that she's not bleeding for 7 24-hour periods. When the 7 days are over, this woman then goes to the mikveh, a ritual bath, and after having gone to the mikveh, she is now no longer in a state of nida. She is now pure. She is Torah. What does that mean in practice during this time when she is a nida, when she is in this state of impurity? So by Torah law, the most important thing to mention is that sexual intercourse between a husband and wife is absolutely forbidden. It's a chiyuv karet, which we discussed in an earlier episode. It is a very serious prohibition. Along with that, sexual touching, at least according to the Rambam, is also prohibited by Torah law. It's prohibited according to everybody. The Rambam would say it's Torah law. And there are many other things that are prohibited by rabbinic law as well, such as all touching, along with things which we call generally harchakot. Harchakot are various actions prohibited by rabbinic decree during the time of nida, and the reason they're prohibited is in order to prevent a husband and wife from feeling overly comfortable with each other, such that they'll fall into habits leading into direct intimacy. So among those things that are considered harchakot are passing from one to the other, sleeping in the same bed. In fact, the beds even need to be separated. The husband should not look at his wife when she's undressed. Eating at the same table without having separate tablecloths or separate placemats or having some sort of recognition there, a reminder of their status. Eating from a single plate, a husband eating his wife's leftovers, serving her husband food, drawing a bath for him, making his bed, sitting on the same bed when she's there or lying on it at all, and sitting on the same bench or couch in such a way that they can feel each other's presence physically. There are many different details, as I've said before. This is just a very, very quick view of it. So these harchakot are very, very serious in the sense that they really distance a husband and wife. It's not just that they can't touch. There are all sorts of things that remind them of their status of not being allowed to be together intimately. And while Rabbi Meir told us, as I mentioned, that it therefore enhances coming back together. In fact, some people would say that it makes the experience of coming back together that much stronger because even passing becomes an intimate act of sorts. On the other hand, many, if not most couples, find these actions during these harchakot, during the time that they can't do them, to be very, very difficult. And that doesn't mean they're complaining about them necessarily, but it's not fun to not be able to pass your wife. It's not fun to have to separate the beds. These are the basic halachot that we're going to talk about today.
Great. Thank you for that overview. I think you've clarified what is expected of a husband and wife in keeping to the guidelines of Taharat HaMishpacha, family purity. I think that we can all relate to the idealized version of why we should keep these laws. Certainly, I was brought up and raised to believe that all of these are positive laws that are meant to keep the marriage fresh, and it prevents sexual problems by keeping things alive, as you say. The other positive messages are that having the time off gives the woman her me time. Not being able to touch forces couples when they're in conflict to communicate verbally and learn other ways of resolving and expressing their feelings to one another other than touch. And let's not forget the traditional aspect. I mean, this is something that is part of the fabric of our society, and we've all heard the stories of our ancestral matriarchs dipping in icy ponds in the name of commitment to the law. And I would even say that if we even go to some more contemporary New Age versions of why we should keep these laws, you'll hear some thoughts about how wonderful it is to be able to go back to our roots as women and be in touch with our bodies and our cycles, and to track your period and ovulation. These are things that women in Western society have moved away from. At the end of the day, it empowers women because they decide when they're ready to go to the mikveh. Nobody forces them. So in this way, she controls her sexuality. So I think there are many messages that women have received, that women do receive, that couples receive, about the positive value of keeping these laws. I think we also need to acknowledge that these are the laws. It's halacha, and this is part of what we do if we're committed to an observant lifestyle. But as you said, these laws are difficult to keep. And I think it's important to also not only idealize, but talk about what the potential struggles and challenges are. And in fact, as a marital and sex therapist, these struggles have been a topic of discussion in the therapy room. And I, as well as other colleagues, wondered if women are keeping the laws, and the laws are supposed to be so enhancing to marriage, why are we seeing so much sexual dysfunction? And so even 20 years ago, my colleagues and I decided to study this. Now, obviously, there are many different factors that contribute to problems in a marriage or problems in sexual functioning. We have to look at the dynamics of the marriage, and there's obviously, we've talked about this before, there are biological factors, hormones, life cycle events. But we went on to study sexual satisfaction in married observant women, and we looked at the observance of the Nida laws as one of those domains that we studied. And we asked women to share their experiences and to what extent they felt that observance of these laws enhances their emotional and physical satisfaction. So I'm not going to go into all the data, but there will be a link to the study in the show notes. We have discussed the benefits, but it's also time to acknowledge that for many couples, and I say this based not only on the data from our study, it's an old study, but also from anecdotal data from my practice, from what my colleagues are hearing, and from what we received. We've received lots of responses by our listeners. And if you go to some Facebook groups these days, you'll also hear a lot, both in Hebrew and in English. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of sadness and anger and other feelings that come up around keeping these laws. So I think that I'd like to just kind of go through some examples of some of those challenges that I, as a therapist and a researcher, can talk about. So many of the women who we've spoken to, and couples, not just women, have talked about sex by the calendar, the pressure to have sex when you aren't up to it because you're going to run out of time. Again, for some couples, this actually may be a factor which is encouraging to them. It allows them to do it when they don't really want to because they're pressured, but then they're happy that they did. So for everything that is a challenge, it can also be reframed for other couples as something positive, but it's not always positive. Sex on mikveh night, like it or not. Mm-hmm. Feelings of abandonment during Nida. As one woman put it, I feel like I have the cooties. I don't like the idea that I'm impure. The difficulty of no touch at all, not even non-sexual touch. Many women talk about how they want to be able to engage in non-sexual touch, yet during Nida time, they can't have any touch. And during non-Nida time, it seems to always go into sexual touch. And they would actually like to be able to have touch which is not necessarily going to be
affectionate,
sexual.
but not sexual.
Yes. And it's particularly difficult not getting a hug after a miscarriage or childbirth, or just when you really need a hug. It's annoying to check yourself. It's annoying to be exposed and scrutinized by the mikveh lady. This is a good time to give a shout out to those who have facilitated a new law which allows women to immerse in the mikveh without an attendant present. There's also the women who talk about using birth control as a way to avoid bleeding and therefore avoid mikveh, but also feeling resentful that they have to do that because they know it's not really good for them. It has a lot of side effects and they wish they didn't have to do that. And then there are also the relational aspects. As one woman put it, my husband would work till midnight every night when I'm Anida, but then as I get closer to going to the mikveh, he suddenly comes home and shows up all the time by 5 p.m. when I'm not Nida. Now, obviously, when you hear that story, a red light is going to flash. There's something more going on here in the marriage that we will need to explore. But for many, many women and couples, these are very real issues.
Well, it's like you said to me off the air, Talli, that the question often has to be, what is the cause and what is the effect? In other words, for certain couples, I'm sure that the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha can be a cause of stress. And for other couples, as you just indicated, it might more be an indicator that something else is going on. The stress they experience during the periods of separation or togetherness might themselves be the result of a deeper problem that has nothing to do with Nida per se.
That's true. And I stand by that. But I also would like to acknowledge that in my practice, I have become aware of many, many couples who simply decide that this level of observance is too difficult, is not worth the stress in their marriage, and that there are many couples today who look for the type of observance that they can tolerate in their marriage. And given that that's the case, I'm interested in hearing both from you and our guests how you would advise couples who are simply not willing to observe the laws in the way that you presented at the opening of this episode.
Well, from my perspective, I'm going to say the same thing that our guest in our recorded interview said as well, which is ultimately what a couple decides to do is exclusively between that husband and wife and God. And no other person is allowed into that relationship but those three individuals or entities, call them as you will. The question then becomes, if they want to say, I'm keeping halacha and I want to keep halacha, but I'm doing it in my own way, what is the breaking point at which I can say, I'm not going to tell you what to do, that's between you and God, but I can't say that this is allowed and you are still keeping halacha when you're doing something which violates halacha.
But you might say, would you not say that if you have a choice between, for example, being less observant or more lenient, would you not advise them to do so during the rabbinic rather than...
So you're asking a really important question. If a couple is not going to keep something, should I advise them, once they're not going to keep something already, to not keep something which is rabbinic rather than something which is a Torah law or a more serious rabbinic prohibition, so to speak? And I can't really answer that. I'll even take it further, which is that I wouldn't advise them about anything. I'd go ask my own rabbis because I don't feel competent to rule on a serious matter like that. I can teach. I'm a teacher. But in terms of ruling or deciding a halacha like that, I wouldn't feel in most cases generally that I could do it on my own. But obviously there are some situations where if someone is told, well, I'm either not going to keep it at all or I'm going to do part of it. We say, well, do what you can. That's obviously better, but I don't want to pretend that because you're doing part of it, that's halachically valid. I teach chatan classes, and sometimes a chatan will ask me certain questions implying that they're not going to keep everything. They rarely say that outright to me, but they'll imply that. What I usually tell them is, I'm going to teach you everything, the way that I understand it and the way that I've learned it and the way that I've asked my teachers about it. And this is what the halacha is. I'm also going to teach you what is Torah law, what's rabbinic law, and in certain situations, what you can forego, but not because you don't feel strong enough to keep it. That's a level which I don't deal with, but instead because there's a competing value. So for example, let's say, I mentioned before, you can't pass when a couple is in a state of nida, but let's say, for example, they're sitting at the Shabbos table and the chal is coming around. Well, now you have two competing values. You have the law that says you cannot pass, and then you have the law of tzniut, that no one's supposed to know that they're in a state of nida right now. So in a case like that, I say you're allowed to pass. That's how I learned it. That's not saying break the halacha. That's saying there's an alternate value which takes precedence according to halacha at this moment. To simply say, though, I'm not going to keep it because I don't feel like, or I can't, or whatever reason is, I'm not going to do it all. Again, that's up to the person and his wife or the woman and her husband, but it's not something which I'm going to sanction and say that's halachically valid. I'll tell them that's between you and God. I will tell you what the halacha is, and you have to make your own decision.
Well, that's great. I thank you for that, and I would love to hear from our guests.
Yes, we're very fortunate to have with us today two Yoatzot halacha. Nechama Goldman Barash made Aliyah from Philadelphia over 20 years ago after graduating from Stern College. She studied for 3 years at Matan's Advanced Talmud Institute and finished a master's degree in Talmud at Bar Ilan University. She's a graduate of Nishmat Yoatzot Halacha program and has been certified to teach brides before their weddings, as well as qualifying as a sex educator through Yahel and the Eden Center. She also studied for 3 years in Matan's Advanced Halacha program, Hilchata. She teaches contemporary halacha and Talmud at Matan and Pardes, as well as Talmud and Women in Halacha in Torah V'Avodah, TVA, a Bnei Akiva gap year program based in Matan. She's an active member of Beit Hillel and participates in interfaith dialogue through Roots, based in Gush Etzion. Atara studied to become a Yoatzot Halacha at Ishmat in Yerushalayim. She worked for several years as a community Yoatzot Halacha in different shuls in the United States, and she directs Nishmat's Miriam Glaubach Center, which educates and certifies Yoatzot Halacha in the United States. It also offers continuing professional education for Yoatzot Halacha, helps place them in communities, provides extensive support for communities employing them, and offers programming for Rebbitzins, mikveh attendants, and Kala teachers. So Nechama and Atara, thank you both very much for being with us today.
And the questions that we would like to ask you, we have been talking about how Taharat HaMishpacha is presented as a positive way to enhance marital satisfaction and passion. And we have found in our work that that is not always the case. What we would like to ask you both is this: how do you advise the women and the couples that you speak with regarding how to keep their marriage alive and how to deal with challenges in their sexual lives as a result of keeping the laws? And also, what would you say, the same question I asked Scott, what would you say to couples who are looking for leniencies as well as ways to prevent their marriage from suffering? And how would you advise them in terms of how much flexibility is available for them halachically? Why don't you start, Nechama?
I think that both your questions reflect, I think, a kind of old-fashioned way, and you're reflecting the literature, and you said, I know your research, Talli, was in the 90s, of looking at it, the idea that there's a perpetual honeymoon or that marriage is, the excitement or passion, the hedge of roses, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb talked about. Meaning, that's all very nice, but the reality is Orthodoxy has a lot of divorce, Orthodoxy has a lot of sexual dysfunction, Orthodox couples have a lot of abuse, meaning there is nothing that has really protected us. And if you go back to the Middle Ages, it wasn't looking that, there were plenty of unfortunate stories and women coming forward with all sorts of problems and so on. So I'm very wary of any rhetoric that promises anything as a blanket, panacea for what is really a tremendous challenge for all couples, religious and secular, in terms of maintaining a kind of both excitement, but I wouldn't even go to excitement, a consistency. Meaning the reality is most couples just want to be having regular sex. Most men and women want to be finding the time to have, whether it's exciting sex or safe sex or, a framework in which they can connect in this intimate way. And so, I'm very wary of kind of these truisms. Oh yeah, if you keep this is really great for your marriage. So I think that halacha in general, it promises you that God will be happy for you. Perhaps it promises you a meaningful life. But at the end of the day, like with Shabbat and like with Kashrut and like with anything in halacha, there is first the element of submission to a higher authority. And then we tend to look for meaning. Why are we doing this? How can this make our lives meaningful? One of the problems with the laws of sexual intimacy, and I really don't like Taharat HaMishpacha. I don't know how it became the catchphrase. It's certainly not from the Gemara. It's not really about purity. We don't have a temple. It's not about family. It's about the sexual intimacy between husband and wife. It's the structuring of sexual intimacy around days of prohibition and days of permission. And so I don't even like the phrase. I feel like we have to come up with something that's more reflective of couples' experiences. One of the things I often point out is, first of all, there's a uniformity to the structure. Talli, there are variables in place within how to count days and what blood creates prohibition and so on and so forth. But you're correct. There is a uniformity in once a woman becomes prohibited, till the bleeding stops and then the 7 clean of blood days, those are pretty much static. And so it creates a uniformity. And as you know, as a sex therapist, nothing about sexuality is uniform, not for the man, not for the woman, not about body image, not about intimacy, not about how they experience sexuality. And so I don't think enough has been really talked about in terms of how complicated the sexual relationship is and how individual it is and how every couple really experiences it differently than another couple, even though obviously there are certain things that are the same, that are common to many experiences. I'll also say that female sexuality is still not fully understood, and it was only really thanks to Masters and Johnson, maybe Kinsey, that anyone started studying female sexuality at all. And so, again, this idea that, here we have this great structure. Well, since we didn't really know anything about female sexuality, it's hard to say that, this was a great structure for the sex lives of men and women. That said, when I teach couples, and I always teach couples, I teach them for a few of the sessions together, I talk a lot about the value of sexual and non-sexual space. In other words, I teach halacha, and then I try to create framework within which you can begin to talk about what the sexual space is going to look like and what the non-sexual space is going to look like. In other words, what we would call the permitted days and the prohibited days. And so, both of those often need mindfulness. In other words, you need to think about what your sexual space is going to look like. How many times do we each expect to be having sex? Meaning we only have, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks a cycle, sometimes even less, 10 days to 14 days to 21 days. And so each of us may have different expectations about what the sexual space is going to look like. And then the non-sexual space. I often talk to couples, I say a little bit like, I don't think we use the language of the Baal Tshuva enough when we teach this. In other words, Shabbat Kashrut, religious couples grow up with. But then when they get to Nida, they've never done it before. Now, disclosure. I teach couples that are not Shomer Negiah. In other words, the couples that come to me already have some sexual experience. They're not all having sex. And they often want to know how to transition into a relationship. They plan to use mikvah. And so I am not getting, again, it'll be interesting for me to hear from Atara who comes to her, but I'm already getting couples, like you said, who come, they're not defiant, but they're very honest. This is what we've been doing. We're not sure how much of this we want to change. We don't want to be having sex anymore when we're Nida, or if we haven't been having sex, then we don't want to be having sex when we're Nida. But, as far as the non-sexual space, we have to think very deeply about how much we're going to separate. Like you said, are we going to touch? Or are we not going to touch? Are we going to separate the beds? Or are we not going to separate the beds? And so I definitely encourage that to be a two-way conversation and not have the curtain falling down as if, okay, now we're doing everything. Well, we haven't been doing everything before, but now we're going to do everything. That's never going to be productive. I would even say for the couples who are, I have had, I think, 2 or 3 that have been scrupulous about not touching at all. And then I talk to them about the myth that, oh, you're going to walk into this new structure and it's going to be great. Your sex is going to be great and your non-sexual space is going to be great. Meaning there's a lot of couples work that has to go on here in terms of communication and respect and expectation. And so I don't see this as very different than areas of how are we managing money? How are we dealing with in-laws? There's a lot of couples work that has to go into how are we interacting with this structure.
Nechama, I really, really appreciate everything that you are saying. I want to structure my next question as a more specific question, and I'm going to ask this to you, Atara, and then after you answer it, maybe hear from you again, Nechama. I think that, Nechama, you are relating to a demographic of couples who may have a little bit more leeway or permission in terms of discussion of how we want to do this and how can we communicate about how we want to do this. But I also think that we have to acknowledge the demographic of couples that all their lives have been pretty used to living according to the letter of the law. And that the idea of modifying the law in order to fit their personal comfort is not consistent with the way that they have lived their lives, yet they are faced with a tremendous amount of distress. So my question to you, Atara, let's say you have a woman who comes to you and she's already in her late 30s. She's finished with her childbearing. Maybe she's even in her 40s. She is going to be dealing with periods monthly, and it is very distressful. It has always been distressful. But let's say she says to you, look, I'm already a woman in my 40s. This business of not touching when I want to hug or separating the beds, it's just too much already. I can't stand it anymore. So I've been using continual progesterone. I've been using a IUD that gives me progesterone all the time. And I have been able to avoid dealing with these laws because of this, because I just cannot deal with it, the feelings of abandonment, and it's just, I can't. My doctor has told me I need to stop doing it. It's not good for my health for whatever reason. What do I do? I mean, I have felt so much control with the idea of this continual birth control. This has been the way that I have dealt with these laws, because it would never occur to me to deal with these laws by not living in accordance with the laws. What would you recommend?
Nechama brought up before that there is this myth about Hilchot Nida being the panacea, the solution to all problems. The truth is, I'm grateful that I was absolutely never taught that in my own personal hadracha before I got married, and yet I do still find people who have that feeling. In fact, even when you look in some of the more popular explanations of Hilchot Nida, it'll actually paraphrase the initial statement. If you look at the initial statement of Rabbi Meir in Masechet Nida, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, the text says, "Mipnei ma amra Torah nida l'shiv'ah." Why does the Torah say that a woman is tmeah for 7 days? It says, "Mipnei sheragil ba v'katz ba amra Torah tehei tmeah shiva yamim k'tehei chaviva l'ba'ala kishat." He gets used to her. He's disgusted by her. And so the Torah says she should be tmeah for 7 days so that she can be beloved to her husband like her wedding night. What everyone paraphrases this as is, why is a woman tmeah every month? And they skip out on the 7-day thing. And I've seen this in right-wing literature, and I've seen this in centrist literature. Everybody skips out on the 7-day thing. Now, I'm going to give benefit of the doubt. I assume they skip out on the 7-day thing because it's going to take a while to explain how the law evolved from what it says in the Torah and the difference between a nida and a zava and 7 days, and why it is that now we wait, as Nechama described, we wait a full 7 days after all reddish menstrual blood has finished. But really is problematic because they present it, right? It could be presented as the reason. I want to quote my mentor and colleague, the first Yoatzot Halacha, Dr. Dina Zimmerman. And she points out that all of the reason that we that we have these stringencies and that we are separated for longer is because of galut, right? We lost some very key traditions as to how to practice these laws, and therefore we go to the most stringent way of keeping things to make sure that we're not violating an isur karet. And so what Dr. Zimmerman says is, well, okay, so maybe let's say that Rabbi Meir's explanation was a reasonable explanation for the times where we maybe were separated from our spouse for a total of 7 days. But that's not where we are right now. Right now, we're separated for more like 12 days is the more common. And depending on a woman's situation, it could be longer. So I think that there's an important message here, which is that we can validate and say, if this is hard, if this is creating some tension, yeah, we're in galut. And parallel to that galut that caused these extra days that we have from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we have a galut, we have extra galut, extra separation from our spouse. And it's not easy. And so I think the most important thing that I do in these conversations, if a woman calls me and she says, I'm in my 40s, this is really very difficult. It was nice and fun when we first got married, although again, there are many calls where women say this was not nice and fun when we first got married, then it's just important to validate that. But at the same time, I do, as Nechama described, I do still see a lot of wisdom in these laws. I mean, again, as I said, for all of the women who are looking to get rid of their periods and looking maybe for a new solution, because the doctor said, whatever solutions are not working. I mean, generally, in my experience, many doctors are recommending Mirena IUDs, assuming that there aren't other mitigating factors. And many women in their 40s are on the Mirena IUD. And therefore, their question is the opposite. I don't have needs are regulating my life, our marital life anymore. Our bedroom is not regulated by anything anymore. And we're having a passion problem. And we always depended on Hilchot Nida to make sure that our passion was there. So I think that both extremes happen. What I think that comes down to is the fact that while I validate that sometimes having to regulate our lives around Nida can add to an extra level of stress, in all long-term marriages, there is the need to work hard to maintain passion. And it's not something that's going to happen without working very hard on it. So I highly recommend the book Passionate Marriage. Talli, I'm curious your thoughts on that book.
By David Snarch.
Ruth Morehouse.
Yes.
I think that, they're focused on making sure that we are differentiated from our spouses, that we are not emotionally fused. I think that there's something to be said for taking this time of space, sexual space from each other, and using it at a time not to retreat to other sides of the house and other sides of the marriage and have nothing to do with each other, right? To have date night, spend time together, but at the same time to use it as a time to become ourselves and to work on ourselves. Because from what I understand, so much of the literature maybe does confirm Rabbi Meir's statement, which is that the more different we feel from the other, that is what creates the passion. That is where the passion comes from. So on the one hand, I validate, I want to make sure that when there's something going on, couples are not, using Hilchot Nida as a mask for what other relationship issues might really be going on underneath the surface. And there's this tendency to say it's Nida's fault, but there's a lot of work to be done. And that's whether we have regular cycles or we don't.
Atara, can I ask you, what's your feeling, though, when there is a problem, even if it really is masking a different problem, but in practice it's being manifest in terms of a couple's having a problem with Hilchot Nida? What would you say if a couple said, we have problems, we want to hold by certain kulot, certain leniencies? And obviously this podcast, I never tire of saying, is not a forum for psak, so this is not psak halacha, but in general, as a general rule, what's your feeling about allowing for some of the harchakot, which we explained at the beginning of the podcast, what they are, allowing some of the harchakot, which are not Torah law? In those contexts, do you suggest or allow couples to be more lenient in that? Or do you say halacha is halacha and there really is no room for leniency? And despite the fact that it may be hurting your marriage, halacha takes primacy.
So I think that people's relationships are in their own private domain. Ultimately, it's between them and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and nobody else. And people make choices and people negotiate their relationships. And I don't think it's all or nothing. But at the same time, that does not mean that halacha bends simply to say what it doesn't actually say. I don't think that we should expect that choices that we make in our personal lives should be seen as a heter, right? This should be seen as, oh, it's really permitted, really it's okay. We make personal choices and they're not always condoned by halacha and they're not always halachically sanctioned. And I've had a lot of heartbreaking conversations of this sort. I would say the more complex conversations are ones where we're actually talking about serious mental health situations where somebody has bipolar disorder, has postpartum depression, borderline personality disorder, severe issues with having any kind of touch in the marriage. I've had both people saying, I'm a mess. I've been in Nida for a long time. Let's say there's a woman who has, the situation of a woman who had a placenta previa, and she was bleeding nonstop in her pregnancy. And that meant months of Nida during a time where she was emotionally in a lot of distress. And forget passion. We're talking about just simple comfort during a time of distress. So these kinds of situations come up. And I know there's an aversion to saying like, oh, we're not going to publicize kulot. But I think that there is importance to knowing that kol mikra legufo, that every situation is individual, and that it's important to go to a halachic authority who is going to work in tandem with the physician and with a therapist in these kinds of situations.
It's a lot of people to talk to before you get that hug.
Yeah. Again, everyone makes their own decisions, but if we're doing things al pi halacha, that is how it goes.
Nechama, how about you? What's your feeling about these same issues in terms of where halacha goes when it's causing stress for the couple?
I would largely agree with Atara in that the halachic structure exists, and I would say there is a lack of sensitivity to the need for emotional touch, largely because the halachic structure is concerned for sexual touch. And as anyone in the field knows, emotional touch can become sexual touch very, very quickly. And so the halacha, as a result, creates all the circles and fences it creates to prevent sexual touch, which already moves you into a transgressive area, according to all opinions, whether you call it biblical or rabbinic. So I'm not sure halacha is where couples can really go for their answer in this area. There are some exceptions. With childbirth, there has been an enormous shift when Rabbi Eli Ofran kind of reminded everyone that, of the position of the Ramah, that if the woman is ill and there's no one else to care for her, then the man can actually touch her to care for her, in a case of sickness. But I will say, until I discovered the Ramah on my own, no one had mentioned him. Meaning it was kind of like the Shulchan Aruch all the way, and the Shulchan Aruch basically says if the woman's sick and the man is not, then the man can't touch her in any way. So I think many couples feel there is a lack of empathy in the halachic sources, and they're not wrong. And there's a lot of fear on the rabbinic part for being misinterpreted, and that there'll be the slippery slope, and people take this to just fool around when they're in the mood and so on and so forth. What has happened is, as Atara rightfully pointed out, when it comes to mental illness, for instance, postpartum depression, anxiety, OCD, meaning almost everyone has anxiety today. Not being able to touch the person you're living with for 12 days can be an enormous hurdle. And I often, when I talk to couples, and I empower them to make decisions, as Atara also said, this idea of, I call it using your seichel. It's not always, running to the rabbi to get a heter to hug when you're at 2:00 in the morning and you're having an anxiety attack or a depressive episode. Really, again, I think that's work the couple has to do. How are we handling this when this happens? Do we want to bring in a rabbi? Do we want to decide on our own? Judaism is also aspirational, meaning you could be kind to yourself and say, okay, we didn't necessarily, we believe in not touching, but there are moments that we will compromise because of the integrity of the relationship. Right now, is stronger than our tremendous fidelity to halacha. It's not that we're compromising on our fidelity, but at this moment, we need to do this in order to support one another. Meaning, I often say to couples, no one would think about not hugging your child for 12 days. Meaning there would be something cruel about doing that, about saying to any of your children, you know what, 12 days, we're not touching, we'll see you. Tell it to a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, right? Touch is such an enormous part of how we feel connected to one another. And I don't think the halacha has responded, or whether it has to or not is another question, but to what more and more we're understanding is the need for touch in relationships. We also don't live in chamulot, meaning at 2 a.m, the only person around is my husband, not my mother, my sister, my best friend. Whereas in the olden days, you lived, you lived in these, in the squares, and everyone was like kind of living on top of each other. Today, you can live in a house that's half a mile from another house if you live in America, or even on a yeshiva. We don't have the relationships where we can knock on someone's door and say, hey, I need a hug. And it's not necessarily going to fulfill the emotional need anyway. More research, I think, has to be done, first of all, into the need for touch and the role touch plays in the emotional and mental health of people, let alone within intimate relationships. I would say the chuvas that I've seen, or the rabbinic conversations I've been a part of, have, as conversations, been largely unsympathetic to things like depression and OCD. And you almost feel there's a fear. If we allow this, I actually was in a conversation once where, if we allow someone after a stillborn or after, a terrible tragedy, after a miscarriage, we're going to allow them to hug? Well, the answer is after a miscarriage is also a very trying and traumatic time. And so I think more work has to be done. I think there are sensitive rabbis you can ask. I've known who to ask, but there are also rabbis who will say, look, what we can do, it's halacha. I think, if you want pastoral counseling, that's okay. If you want to kind of, in those moments, make a decision that reflects the needs, you have to, I tell couples to be kind to themselves and to recognize every month is a new opportunity to evaluate. We're in a relationship with God that lasts our entire lives. Like any relationship, it has its ups and downs. We have to remember God loves us. We spend too much time focusing on the punishments and the sins and the transgressions. Every time we sin, we're alienated from God. I'm going to quote Rav Weinberger from Yeshiva University, who I heard a tremendously powerful podcast that he did, and I can refer you to it, who said, we don't spend enough time telling our children that God loves them. All we spend time is God's going to be angry, God's going to punish, you're doing this wrong, and so on. And so here, too, I think there's a lot of shame and guilt that's embedded into anything having to do with sexuality and decisions made that step over any lines. And I think we need to change the way we speak about these things a little bit and help couples, again, bring God into the bedroom, aspire for Kedusha, aim for Kedusha, but also recognize there are moments in which there is weakness or there is an emotional need. And then, then we go back to picking up the relationship and strengthening it.
I really appreciate that approach. I think it is very soothing. And I think it's a beautiful reframe. Please, Atara, let's hear from you.
So Nechama at the very beginning, discussing the way in which we answer to a higher authority when we're keeping halakha. I think that one of the main messages or important messages that I get from keeping Hilchot Nida in general is the idea of not judging my marriage based on this moment, this day, this week, this month, but rather seeing myself and my husband in a continuum, we have different phases of life, and the way that life hits me and life hits us and the challenges we face at one phase are going to be different. And I still remember once a woman calling me and saying, I'm really struggling with harchakot, and this is so hard for me, and I don't understand. This is draconian. My love language is physical touch, and how in the world can I be told for 12 days to not touch my husband? This is really, really hard. And when I dug deeper into what was going on in her marriage, she had been married for a total of 6 months, and she was on seasonique, which meant that she had had a total of 2 periods. And on the basis of 2 periods, she had decided that the lifelong wisdom or the eternal wisdom and the collective wisdom of our rabbis was wrong. And again, I validate. I understand that in a given month and in a given year, this is something, depending on what's going on in the marriage, that can be a challenge, whether it's
So what would you say to her? How would you have counseled her? How did you counsel her?
Right. It's a counseling that requires an appeal to wisdom. Now, I'll never forget when I was getting married. One of my closest friends had just gotten married, and she came up to me in the Stern cafeteria. She put her hands on my shoulders. I can almost feel her hands on my shoulders still to this day, and said, "Oh my gosh, this Nida stuff is really hard." And I try to remember that. And I'm really glad that happened to me, because I really try to have that empathy, because I've been there and it was really hard, and it still is really hard. And I think it's a sign of a good marriage when it's really hard. I think when we want touch, that's a positive thing. That's not a negative thing in our marriages. That doesn't mean that, I think I differ a little from Nechama in that I don't know that I would tell a couple, again, I tell a couple, we all are responsible for our own decisions and we make choices. But I don't know that I would want to paint our rabbis' decisions and halachic positions as being out of touch with humanity. I think that they understood how humans work. I think that there's a maturity to recognizing that I don't have all the answers, and the way that I feel in this very moment is not necessarily the way in which I'm going to feel tomorrow, and it might be wrong, and it might change my mind. And so maybe I'm going to trust our tradition a little bit in these matters.
Okay, this has been really helpful, really useful. I could really see where Nechama's approach and your approach differ and would definitely speak differently to a different demographic. And I think that's why it's so great that there's such a broad range of Yoatzot, and that everybody can find somebody to whom they can look to give them the guidance and the structure and the framing that speaks to them.
Ultimately, I try to encourage couples to find their way, to find the meaning that they can in the system, to ask questions, not to feel so alone. I spend a lot of time normalizing. But I will say that even this week, I got a very painful WhatsApp from a young woman struggling with various issues. Also talking about, again, being on the verge of stopping to keep this, of not being able to handle it. It is the first year, and I would say the first year is often very, very difficult, meaning you're trying to create a sexual relationship, and these laws can very much, or this structure can very much impede, just like at menopause, right? Towards the end of the fertility period, suddenly there can be challenges of, I thought we were dealing with this, and then we're need far more than we thought. And I think just normalizing, like what Atara says she does, that you validate, you normalize, you let people feel less alone. They're doing it anyway by going to the internet. I try to be very respectful and bring a lot of respect for the halachic structure, but at the same time also not leave couples feeling that they are again, it often they're drowning or bitter or resentful or, as I said, very alienated. We can all just keep trying to do the work, avodat kodesh, that so many of the Yoatzot and rabbis and people in the field, therapists and physical therapists and so on, keep doing. And hopefully, as the years go on, we'll continue to know more and more information that helps illuminate some of these subjects.
Atara, last words for you?
I want to bring a story from one of my colleagues, Yoatzot Halacha Shana Goldberg. She and her husband, Dr. Judah Goldberg, wrote an article called the Baal Habayit Centered Halachic Consultation. And they talk about how important it is to, similar to the trend in medicine, to basically see the patient as a significant participant in the care choices for the particular situation. So too with halacha. And she tells a story about how there was a woman who she actually said is more yeshivish, if that's relevant or not, who confided in her that she was really struggling with the harchakot. And she and her husband came to the decision that because harchakot were so difficult for them, they were going to decide not to keep the visatot, which is the laws of what you're supposed to do when you're anticipating the arrival of menstruation, in exchange for working on the harchakot. And it was very interesting to Shana, or maybe more than interesting, shocking, because she said that, when it comes to a lot of the rules of this atot, they are much more, shall we say, important. With the harchakot, there's a lot of layers. As Rabbi Kahn described, there's a lot of layers to them, and there are things that are off limits biblically, and there are things that are off limits that are very sourced in the Talmud, and then things that come up in the Rishonim, and things that come up in the Achronim. And obviously, we have to keep them all. If we're rabbinic Jews, we do our best to keep them all. The smallest thing, the way that we keep the most difficult thing. But it struck Shana that with this woman, because she didn't understand the different weight of the different rules, and she didn't know that there are certain leniencies when it comes to certain harchakot, depending on the situation. Here she was, and she was sacrificing an area of law that perhaps should have been more punctilious about, in order to keep an area that, again, is incredibly important and wise and important, but perhaps could have, had she gone through each thing, she could have come to they could have come to an understanding in a different kind of way. So
knowledge is power. The more you understand, the more you know, the better decisions you're going to make. And that, by the way, I remember back in the early days reading something, I don't remember the name of the book, but every paragraph ended with, consult your rabbi, consult your rabbi, consult your rabbi. There was no empowerment for women to understand the significance and meaning of different stains on their own. And what you're saying actually is learn the halacha, know what to do, know what's important, and know what's less important. I don't think that you're saying not to consult. That would be over reframing what you're saying. But what you're saying is it's important to know.
I would go out of business.
You would go out of business. But what you're saying is trust yourself to know your body as well, and trust yourself to know the laws, and consult, but make those decisions based on the correct knowledge.
Exactly.
Atara and Nechama, thank you both for joining us today on Intimate Judaism. That was very, very enlightening. And Talli, listening to their talking about how they would respond to these issues as halachic scholars, it made me think about what you would say as a therapist. How would you deal from a therapy perspective if a couple were to come to you and say, we're religious Jews, we keep the laws of Nida, or we want to keep the laws of Nida, but we find it impeding and damaging our marital relationship?
That's a great question. Obviously, I'm not sitting with a couple as an halachic authority, and these laws and this lifestyle and difficulties with these laws and decision-making around these laws. To me, the laws themselves, the subject is the content. And the content can be anything. It can be religious. It can be over money. It can be over sex. It can be over in-laws. It can be whatever the conflict is. I'm not there to help them actually resolve the conflict. I'm there to help them look at the dynamics of how they relate to each other in the struggle, if there is a power struggle, if there is conflict. Do the partners each see this matter differently? Are they able to hear and respect one another? Sometimes even just being able to hear the other partner talk about how hard it is, and for the other partner to stop defending and say, you know what, I get it. It really is hard, is all that this couple really needed. It's about the ability to empathize with one another. So this situation, this kind of situation presents me with a lot of very rich material. For example, the young woman that Atara was discussing who was so angry and resentful at the rabbis, and she mentioned how she would counsel from a cognitive point of view. I would be more interested in delving deeper into that resentment and where these feelings are coming from, the lack of empowerment, the feeling that she doesn't have her own agency or autonomy, and where does that come from? The feelings of abandonment that many women talk about, those feelings are primitive feelings. So they may be triggered by the laws of Nida, but they probably didn't begin there. And so this really provides a very rich opportunity, the idea of feeling rejected. For example, a couple that their dynamics change so dramatically around mikvah time. This provides a lot of material to talk about without necessarily talking about what you would change or what you wouldn't change or what to discuss with a rabbi or what not to discuss. These are matters that I tend to stay away from and let the couple figure out for themselves.
there are a lot of interesting halachic issues in what Nechama and Atara said that were brought up as well, which I found fascinating. And I'm not answering the questions because I don't know if they're answerable, certainly not on a podcast. But there's an interesting dynamic in hearing the different responses that each of them brought to the table. For example, the fact that Atara mentioned that we're in galut, the fact that we're in exile, therefore that makes it harder. And yes, it is harder. There is such a thing as halacha in galut, not being in its, so to speak, ideal state. And for the record, the Torah mentions something similar to this as well. When describing the halachot of Nida, he describes it a chumrah on top of a chumrah, a stringency over a stringency. He's not saying, therefore, don't do it. But what he means is that, yeah, there are a lot of things here because of our lack of ability to discern different colors and different situations. Yeah, there are certain chumras and certain things that are not easy whatsoever. And we shouldn't pretend that halacha is going to make life easy for us all the time. I think that there are interesting questions that are raised by this. For example, the dynamic between Nechama and Atara makes me wonder in terms of their own answers to this. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but would either of them argue that Chazal, our sages, had an enlightened sensibility, an understanding of psychology that would be modern in a certain sense? And if they didn't, would that affect the halacha nowadays? For example, if one were to say that, they understood halacha very well, they understood psychology and human sexuality on a very, very high level, advanced for that time, advanced for nowadays. There are plenty of people who would say that. If one says that, then obviously the fact that people are upset about it or find it difficult wouldn't affect the halacha one way or the other. On the other hand, someone might argue that because they did not have a modern understanding of sexuality, maybe they would have made the halacha differently. Someone could still argue that's true, but that still doesn't change the halacha. Somebody else would say, yes, it does. There are all sorts of interesting halachic dynamics that come up in a conversation like this. So this, once again, is very much an opening rather than a closing session in discussing these issues, which can go on for a very, very long time.
Sounds like we might have to have another episode.
I think so.
Just on this topic.
Once again. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And remember, once again, to subscribe to Intimate Judaism, you can go to www.intimatejudaism.com to be part of our email list, as well as to see a source sheet there. You also can, by looking up this episode 10, find Talli's study that she mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. We'll have a link to that.
It's the study of Dr. Michelle Friedman and Dr. Rachel Yehuda, and I am one of the authors of the study.
And remember to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And please share and let people know about the podcast so we can get the word out even further. Thanks again for everyone who wrote in, giving their personal stories. It really helped us to formulate this episode.
Thank you. Bye.